Thank you all for coming to this session. This is a Wilson Center session, right? Yeah. But the Center for the Study of Global Christianity is hosting the speakers, so I'm here too. And we're grateful you could come and think about this important subject with our speaker who is an expert on this subject. And I'd like to introduce my friend, the Reverend Dr. Darrel Jackson, who grew up on the Isle of Man and came to faith in 1972, was baptized in 1979, gained a BA at the London School of Theology, and was ordained as a Baptist pastor in 1989. He served in pastoral ministry, regional ministry, was the National Mission Advisor to the Baptist Union of Great Britain from 96 to 2003, served as the executive researcher for the Conference of European Churches Geneva, and became the founding director of a sister research center to ours, the Nova Research Center. And it was a lecturer in European Mission, Redcliffe College in England. And then in 2012, he relocated with his family, his wife Beth, and two children, Kai and Karis, and they all moved to Sydney, Australia, where he took up the position of senior lecturer in missiology at Morling College, the Baptist Theological College for New South Wales. He's currently supervising PhD candidates from Sri Lanka, Australia, Nigeria, China, so there's a lot of variety in that. He's vice president of the Australian Association of Mission Studies, and he's a Mission Commission associate of the World Evangelical Alliance, which means he should be in Panama in October with our colleague Bert Hittman, but you're not sure you're going. It's hard to get to Panama from Australia. And he's a member of the International Association of Mission Studies, which is meeting in Korea in August. I was supposed to go. I'm not going to be able to go, but Darrel will be there. And he's the chair of the Lausanne International Researchers Network, and I'm on the board of that group, and we're planning to meet in Africa in 2018. So we actually work together a lot. We're also working together on Lausanne Global Analysis, which is something you can look up and go to some terrific articles there. But without further ado, I'd like us to welcome Darrel and hear what he has to say about mapping migration. Okay, thank you.
With a resume that long, I didn't expect Todd was going to read all of that, so thank you for that. I could almost set you an assignment on that, I think, now, so we can discuss the introduction. The most important thing of all of that is, it's not in there, but it should be probably, is just disciple of Jesus. I think when we see ourselves in that light, we understand better how we can serve God and His church. And that's what my work has been largely around. When I talk about my work in Europe, particularly my research interest in the forms of intercultural Christianity and migration that one finds in Europe. What I'm going to share with you today grows out of an initial 3-year research project that I was commissioned to undertake in Europe, mapping examples of good practice in mission and evangelism across Europe, though all of those countries that are part of the Council of Europe, so we're talking about 45 different countries. And subsequent to that, when that position ended in 2007, I've been engaged in ongoing work, particularly focused on migration and diaspora in Europe, both from Europe and into Europe, and interior to Europe as well, internal to Europe. More having worked with an Italian colleague, we produced in 2008 a first edition of this book, Mapping Migration, Mapping Churches' Responses in Europe. And this is a new, revised, and updated version. And for those of you who are working on postgraduate projects that are trying to integrate theology with other disciplines, perhaps sociology, anthropology, perhaps demographics, this is an attempt, a working attempt to do that. So I write as a missiologist. My co-author is an Italian Baptist, and she writes in this particular instance as a sociologist. So it's good fun as we're talking together about the phenomenon of migration. Same people, same movements, same situations on the ground, and yet each of us trying to use slightly different language as we talk about this particular phenomenon. She clearly is writing as a believing sociologist, but she writes primarily as a sociologist. And that alerts me immediately to the fact that when we come to talk about migration, there are many different ways we can talk about it. There are many different theoretical perspectives. Anthropologists, sociologists, demographers, geographers all have their own questions about what the meaning might be and what the questions one might ask of the phenomenon of migration. And I draw these from one of the leading books that's addressing the theory of migration. But it's interesting that nowhere in the book is mentioned theology. And it seems to me that as human beings, everything we do demonstrates that we are theory-laden individuals. We act out our convictions about the world, the theories we hold, and for those of us who follow Jesus, those are theologically shaped theories and convictions about the world. And so when we look at somebody's behavior, somebody's actions in the world, when we see their expressed attitudes, we're able to see those theories laid bare in some respect. But of course, we're also theory-laden observers. And so we bring to what we observe those theological frameworks and worldviews, cultural worldviews, shaped by our understanding of the Christian gospel and the Christian worldview. And we are naturally interpretive beings. We want to interpret what others are acting out. We want to ask, why are they doing that? And so theologically, it seems to me, we need to add this as at least one theoretical way to understanding the phenomenon of migration. And at least one question that we might ask is whether the notion of a new redeemed humanity critiques all ethnic and national distinctions. And there are many others you could ask, but that's at least one. And so this theological framework drives in large part my own engagement with the subject. And whilst we'll eventually arrive at a point of application and usefulness, at this point, I think it's just important to point to the fact that it's sometimes too easy to slide over the theological and just engage in a sociological conversation. We must, I think, as followers of Jesus, be able to deploy theological language and theological categories to understand what we're looking at. So let me then take you as a fairly leisurely pace through the book and through the findings, and then hopefully there'll be time for you to engage in question, comment, critique, response. Some of you may have got some knowledge of contemporary migration in Europe. You may want to compare it with contemporary migration here in the States. I'm doing something similar with what I observe currently in Australia. So there's great value in the comparative approach. So do feel free. You may not know anything about migration in Europe. You may be thinking, well, he's not mentioned Hispanics. That's a big issue for us in the States. Or there's another group that he's not mentioned. Feel free to just raise that at the end, and we'll engage together, hopefully, in conversation. Why is migration particularly timely? Why is a discussion about migration and a new revision of the book just published in January this year, why is that revision so timely? Well, it largely revolves around the fact that we have seen of recent months and years significant numbers of new arrivals in Europe. And you will be all too aware of this if you watch the watch the TVs and read newspapers and check online news sources. This is a theme that runs current. I check a European news source most days, and of the 4 or 5 headline articles over the last year, I would estimate that at least 1 or 2 every day feature migration. Now, this is just dominating the political and public conversation in Europe. We cannot escape addressing it. So this significant increase in new arrivals, well illustrated by the fact that the total numbers of global refugees has significantly increased when we look at the numbers from the Middle East and North Africa. You'll notice these are 2013 figures. Those of my colleagues who are working with demographics and statistics will know that often we are working with data that is at best 18 months old in these kind of global compilations of data. So this is the most recent data other than small snapshots. 65% change between the start of 2013 and the end of 2013 of refugees from the Middle East and Northern Africa. And where do they go? to countries that are close to the Middle East and Africa. And which are those countries? European countries, of course. So this is a significant factor for us. And of course, what that means for the European religious landscape is that we have increased and greater religious diversity. And not only are new arrivals from the Middle East and North Africa, as we often think, Muslim, many of those are coming with a Christian background, a Christian cultural identity. And so this is adding to the mix. And of course, it impacts the earlier religious balances. And indeed, within Europe, we've seen some fascinating instances where suddenly we discover there's a million new Protestants in a formerly dominant Catholic country. And that changes the way that the governments and nation states respond to their religious elements within their and amongst their populations. Now, of course, as churches, we clearly have a ministry and a calling to ministry, a calling to mission, to engage with all those who are present in our midst as neighbors, even as strangers. That's the biblical insight that we can gain. And with my sociological colleague, we had to ask ourselves, what do we say together that makes any sense as a theologian and as a sociologist about migration? What can we say together? How can we possibly talk about this same thing? And after a lot of conversation and Skype conversations from Sydney to northern Italy, we are finally, having eliminated a lot of themes, felt that the most appropriate themes to examine throughout this work, as those working and seeking to equip churches, will be the themes of integration, belonging, and community. Now, you notice here I put identity. That didn't quite make it into the final mix. It was very close, but we felt that we wanted to very much focus on the practical provision of what does the church do in order to foster integration, to foster community, and to foster a sense of belonging. Identity questions, of course, are part of that, but nevertheless, that was where we felt we should pay our attention. And indeed, statistically, it's much easier, actually, to count and to measure the measurements for integration and belonging. And we were interested particularly to understand the religious dimension to migration, and also what were churches doing vis-a-vis migrants in Europe? What was their stance towards migrants? And that became a key theme as we investigated the extent to which churches were trying to integrate, foster belonging, and foster community. Now, as I say, it's made somewhat easier for us because the European Union has an official data collecting service called Eurostat, and it hoovers up all the national data that all the national governments have been producing, and it collates them and creates master databases. And legally, that agency is tasked with collecting data on behalf of the European Union. And in one of the instances, in 2010, was asked to begin to collect data to measure integration. How effectively were new arrivals in Europe being integrated, and how could they be integrated? And after a lot of political discussion, it was decided that the four key measures of integration within the European Union that would be measured, and measurements would be developed to do that, would be in the area of education. In other words, how much ready access did migrant children particularly, but also those in tertiary education, how easy was it for them to access education? And that, of course, implies language ability, so that underlies much of this. Again, access to the employment, the job market, measures of social inclusion, so the extent to which one is able to vote or participate in local authority business as a citizen, or as a guest, or as a migrant guest, and again, the degree to which the person is actively participating in their community or their society. And now, other agencies feel that those measurements are not quite sophisticated enough, and there's another list here of 7. And interestingly, the Migrant Integration Policies Index is the creation of a group of church-based researchers who eventually moved out of that arena to set up their own social policy unit, advising the European Union on measures of integration, but they do so from a faith perspective and a faith commitment. And what that means is that we can then begin to measure progress in integration. So I just give you here the headline for the European Union between 2007 and 2010. The blue line is the most recent line, and the closer it is to the edge, it indicates that it's doing better in those areas. So, for example, here on the bottom left of the screen, you'll notice long-term residence. One of the measurements that is looked at by the European Union, that this is the one of the areas where the European Union is beginning to improve its engagement with its migrant population. It's improved measures slightly in terms of anti-discrimination, and also in broad terms has managed to improve its access to nationality. And of course, you'll notice that this stops at 2010. The 2015 figures are not yet available. It will be interesting to see what is happening in the light of the recent increasing numbers of arrivals. And that's always the political reality against which we're engaging in this study. So how do we go about engaging in our work? We used a typical survey. Some of you will have used survey work, perhaps, questionnaires, which we sent to a range of denominations, around about 150 denominations across Europe. We used 3 open-ended questions and a semi-structured questionnaire. We had particular interests in asking for some particular information that we could then begin to quantify. But we wanted also to capture some data as the churches wanted to present it to us. And I'll show you some examples of that a little later. We had, as I said, this focus on the 3 themes. So we were asking questions of the churches about integration, belonging, community. And I'll give you insight into some results from those questions shortly. And then there were 3 sections. We were interested in the degree to which migrants are engaged in the life of the churches. We were interested in the degree to which the church was working amongst migrant young people, which includes also first, second, third generation. And thirdly, we were interested in what are you doing for migrants in terms of welfare, advocacy, aid, assistance, and so on. As I say, we had also, well, I didn't say this, but we did have, in this edition, an attempt to capture the voice of the migrant. In our first edition, we had a fairly lightweight attempt to do this. But in this one, in our final chapter, we work hard at gathering up responses to an open-ended, semi-structured interview questionnaire that my colleague deployed around Europe with a team of researchers and gathered up stories of the ways in which migrants had experienced church as they had encountered it on arrival in Europe and in ongoing encounter with it. And the people we interviewed were broadly representative in terms of male-female, lay-ordained, younger, older, ethnically diverse, etc. And I believe it forms a really valuable conclusion to the book, and I'm really pleased we did do that. So how do we make statistics, demography interesting? That's always a question for those of us who've produced bar charts and graphs in the past. And happily, in the 7 years between the first edition and this edition, those of us working in the area of demographics in terms of Christian research work have gained an awful lot of knowledge in the use of infographic. And so in the report, we have, for each country in the Council of Europe, every one of the 45 countries, a page which gives access to this kind of information. So this is just the top half of the page of Germany. And you'll see immediately, somewhat to the top left there, you've got the overall population figure, some 80 million. Beneath that, you have then the migrant population of just under 10 million people. Now that migrant figure for Germany includes all the internal EU migrants as well. So this isn't just everybody from Syria, in case you're wondering. This is everybody who... I have a right to go and live and work in Germany, although I'm British. But because I have a European passport, I can go and live and work there without anybody saying you can't do that. I can even vote in European elections that are being held in Germany. I have those rights. So this includes many individuals from other European Union countries, including just under 500,000 from Italy, you'll notice on the top right. So around about 11.9% of migrants as the total population are present in Germany. We present data regarding various international treaties that Germany is a party to here on the left-hand side, and when Germany signed those. So it gives, again, when one compares different countries, an indication as to how seriously the country is taking its obligations under international treaties, and in terms of how one is able to hold that country accountable to its obligations. So when you, as a church leader in Germany, sense maybe the government is doing something or local authority is doing something in treating a migrant that may not seem to fulfill its obligations under one or more of these treaties, you can actually call them out on it. You have a right of appeal to these particular sorts of organizations, and where they are European, you have an appeal to the European Court of Human Rights for them, and they will then be required to make a judgment in areas if they feel there's a case to be made. On the top right-hand side, you get a sense of the kinds of migrants that are in Germany, where they've originated. 1.5 million Turkish immigrants. That's the largest group in Germany by far. It represents a group that were invited into Germany in the late 50s and 60s. They were invited as guest workers, or Gastarbeiters in German. And they have never been allowed to gain German citizenship. 1.1 million Poles, just over 1 million Russians, 717,000 Kazakhs. These are Germanic or ethnic German peoples who would have been moved by Stalin within the Soviet republics during the 50s and 60s. And many of those Kazakhs are ethnic Germans, actually, many of them Mennonites, interestingly. And those were given the right to return to Germany following the political changes in the early 1990s. And so you can see here further bits of data for each of the countries. Germany again, we have Pew data, the Pew organization, based not too far away from here, which is working on trying to identify the religious component, religious dimension to migration. And we use their data to try and understand the overall nature of religious affiliation amongst migrants. So it gives you an immediate sense that of the, going back to the top left, 9 million migrants, 9.8 million, that roughly 5.5 million of those are Christian migrants. And again, we often have the sense that this country, whether that's Australia, America, Germany, is being overrun by Muslims. But here we have data which reminds us that, in fact, yes, there is a significant Muslim population. And how we respond to that must be done in the light of these sorts of data, where we see 5.5 million. Culturally, notionally, self-identifying as Christians. On the bottom left, we have what I call soft data. This is data that's been that's been generated by smaller research institutions without the kind of massive resources that governments or intergovernmental agencies can bring to the issue. And so these represent something of an estimate. And the report uses the term irregular migrant of anybody who crosses a border, exercising their right under the United Nations Charter to do so in where they fear for their life, but they do so without proper documentation. You may have heard the term illegal immigrant. We feel that that criminalizes the migrant unnecessarily and prefer the term either undocumented or irregular migrants, and this is the term that this particular report uses. We gather a range of other statistics. You'll recognize the spider chart there on the top right, which is this measure of integration, and we have one of those for each country. Bottom right, you'll notice a figure for every country in Europe, which talks about the number of emigrants. So these are Germans working overseas, who then remit back to the country money to relatives living in Germany. And in this particular case, $15 billion are remitted every year by migrants living outside of Germany back into Germany. And this becomes an important part of how we then can understand the flow not only of people, but of money and the impact on an economy of migration. A lot of work around that figure that is meant to represent the kind of refugee, the asylum seeker, and you'll see figures that are related to that. You'll also notice in this report that for the first time we're able to begin to record the numbers of those who have been victims of human trafficking. So you'll see around about the center of the screen there, a figure of 626. These are individuals who've been identified by the authorities, be they the police or the social welfare services, as being trafficked. This is not to suggest that this is only the number in Germany. One suspects this is far higher. But these are those who have been identified and effectively given a way out. And I expect this figure to become rather more robust as the European Union gains expertise in collecting this kind of data. This is an early piece of data. Then on the lower left-hand side, you have this door image, and here we're trying to capture data from the World Values Survey, or the European Values Survey, that asks a question about attitudes. Who would you want living next door to you as a neighbor? Would you want any of these? Would you want somebody ethnically different to you living next door? Well, in Germany, just under 5% of people said no. Would you want an immigrant living to you next door? Just over 10% said no. We don't want any immigrants living next door to us. Thank you very much. Muslims, a quarter of those interviews said no, we don't want a Muslim living next door to us. Thank you very much. However, and this is interesting, and this is a particular European phenomena, there are indigenous minority groups in Europe that are, we sometimes call them Gypsy or Roma or Sinti. And these are the people who are actually more feared than the Muslims, interestingly, particularly in Central Europe. And on all measures, across all countries in Europe, the most unwanted neighbor is likely to be a Gypsy. And it represents all our fears about the other. But the Muslims also facing that feeling at the moment. And again, in the light of the current wave of migrants into Europe, many of them would be perceived as being Muslim. It'll be interesting to see how that figure changes in the next couple of years. Can we conduct, in any way, a conversation then about this whole phenomenon theologically? Yes, I believe we can. It requires us to draw on our biblical narrative, the biblical text, the scriptural text. It requires us to look into our Christian tradition, and that requires in part a reflection on the history of Christian migration. There's some really fascinating stuff written about, I don't know whether you're a fan of John Calvin, but John Calvin's Geneva, at one point, all of the pastors in the Genevan church were migrants from across Europe. And they were resented. They were unreliable tenants. They would disappear at any moment because God had told them to go back to Spain or off to Italy to do mission work or to start a church. So they were unreliable. They were resented. They ate foreign food. They sometimes didn't pay their rent on time. And so the popular literature of the time is quite critical of this influx of migrant reformers, and if only they go back home. So it's part of our own story. So it's Christian history, ethics, can be brought to this conversation. And of course, the way that theology makes use of empirical data. I'm about to show you a map, or rather a graphic. It will probably confuse you. I'm just going to show you it to show you the complexity of the conversation. But that's it. Okay, it's going to be up there for about 10 seconds. I'm going to turn it off because it's not important to you. But just to underline the fact that trying to understand what it means for a migrant to be a neighbor, to be my neighbor, is key to this conversation, I think. You know, you and I can choose who we invite for dinner, but we can't choose necessarily who comes to live next door as a neighbor. And I think that's the far greater import of Jesus' words, to love God and to love your neighbor. And some would say, love your neighbor as yourself. Some would say, love your neighbor for they are like you in every way. So there's something quite, I think, fundamental about that understanding, and that's what my next book project is all about, trying to understand that. So what do we find out from our church survey? This will be where some of you go to sleep and where some of you wake up. And you'll see here that 40% of the churches in our sample said that fewer than 5% of those in membership of our church are migrants. And then about half of those churches surveyed said, well, somewhere between 6 to 20% of our membership is composed of migrants. So that was an interesting finding for us. We'd not tried to gather this kind of data before, but it gave us some insights into what was happening within those various denominations we surveyed. This shows you the countries in Europe where it's more likely that you will have a higher percentage of migrants in your membership. So Finland at the top there, the British Isles towards the left of the screen, and of course then Portugal, Spain, France, to Germany, Italy, Switzerland, the Netherlands are the countries with the greater likelihood of having migrants in church membership. Often this is for colonial reasons. You think of the Portuguese colonies, the Spanish colonies, the French colonies, the British colonies. There were no Finnish colonies as far as I'm aware of, but that just shows that this is a very cold country. Nobody wants to go and live there, so they need more Finnish people quickly. One of the ways that obviously churches can effectively show that they're intentionally trying to integrate migrants is the degree to which they have resources and policies that support multicultural congregational life. And so we were interested to find out two things: whether the church has resources for multicultural worship and prepares them, or whether it has a policy on multicultural worship. Obviously one at the local level, the resources for multicultural worship, one at national or denominational level, a policy on multicultural worship. That was what we were interested in. But you'll see that by far, in all measures, both measures, the churches were saying, no, we don't have anything intentional. Just over a third said we've got some resource for multicultural worship. That could be a multicultural songbook with the same song printed in 3 or 4 different languages. It could be prayers written in a different language made available in that kind of way. But only a third has that kind of resource. We use various categories in the book. This isn't a main part of my presentation, but just to let you know that we attempt some definition of what we mean when we talk about ethnic minority, international church, intercultural church. The one thing we stress throughout is that everybody has an ethnicity. I am ethnic. Just because I'm Caucasian doesn't mean to say I'm non-ethnic. I'm talking about myself when I'm using the word ethnic, and we do. Does your church have policies to encourage migrant participation in organization and leadership? You know, my church has many. We have about 26 different countries represented in my church's congregation, but not quite so many in leadership. And that's often the case, that we struggle to find and equip and mentor and prepare leaders from ethnic minority groups within our congregations. But 40% of them said, at least, yes, we do have policies to encourage migrant participation in leadership. And we'll hear from one of those towards the end of this presentation. What percentage of those positions are held by migrants? By far the majority said, well, actually, it's fewer than 5% of our leadership positions are held by migrants. So again, it's still a tiny minority. Churches generally, however, are doing better when it comes to providing practical assistance to migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. And this question was intended to ask questions about the degree to which that particular church partnered with other agencies to provide services. That's the green bar. And then we were interested to see whether the church, or the denomination, I should say, had a team working in these issues within the structures. That's the red bar. And then whether there was a particular office or a department working on asylum refugee issues on behalf of the family of churches, and that was the blue bar. And you'll see that in all those 3 measures, around about 40%, 4 out of every 10 says we do have something that broadly speaking reflects what you're asking us. So what can we say about, broadly speaking, worship in the congregations of the churches surveyed across Europe at least? The second answer is probably, the second point is the one that gives us the better answer, that those who answer that their parishes tend to worship together can be subdivided into 3 groups. Parishes with only a small number of migrants in their midst, who are just part of the larger congregation. Those which are migrant-led, in other words, their leader or their pastor, someone on their worship team are part of the migrant ethnic minority group. And those which have in place policies for promoting multicultural worship or resources are more likely to have congregations that have this sense of ethnic diversity as the church meets to worship Sunday by Sunday. And I guess the logic of our focus on integration is this is the direction that we want to see and encourage churches to move towards, is to find themselves in a place where they're able to worship together and somehow model something of the reconciling love of Christ. But I realize that behind that there's an awful lot of big issues that one has to address along the way. And some of you may want to raise that later. That'd be good. What about the migrant voices? We're getting close to the end now. Well, this, I think, was something of a negative response from a male Ghanaian who had been in Italy for some years, and as a Pentecostal was reflecting on his first engagement with a Italian Pentecostal church in the late 1980s. He said, I visited the church for about 18 months. Nobody came to greet me. Nobody welcomed me. I didn't know them, and they didn't know me. We were two different worlds. He continues, I came from an Assemblies of God background. Now, everything they did in Italy was the same. I could sing the songs because of the way the hymn goes. I was singing, presumably, in Ghanaian, and the Italians were singing in Italian. Even though I couldn't speak Italian, I could recognize they were singing some hymns that I already knew. I could understand the preaching by following the Bible. I was present at everything they did, but actually what was lacking was that they didn't speak my language, and I didn't speak theirs. Now, they could have come and saluted me or greeted me, shake hands, but they didn't. That's a fear thing, isn't it? I mean, I fear that. I find it very awkward. How do I greet somebody if I can't speak their language? But a smile, a handshake can go a long way, and this male Ghanaian pastor, now a pastor, indicates that. Now, we have another pastor, a female from the Netherlands, Indonesian by background, and she says, let me start with being critical to us as migrants. Now, many migrant churches are isolated. Of course, that's understandable because they are small and they're just new. But for some of us, it's been like this for a long time, and that's not good because the church has to look outside and broaden its perspective. Most migrants are not very positive of the idea of being integrated into the society because they're either afraid or they feel that the Dutch society is less moral than us. Now, that's an interesting point. I do come across that very regularly. They drink a lot of alcohol. They accept homosexuals. They accept euthanasia. So, migrant Christians must be more positively open to the Dutch society. Now, I don't mean to say that we should have to accept all their moral, ethical things. No. But we can try to understand the standpoint of the other, to be in dialogue. That's a key phrase, I think, to be in dialogue. They mostly judge first, she's talking about her migrant community, and then they say, Dutch society is evil. Now, those are rich accounts, and much as I love the rich and broad patterns of demographic data, these kinds of accounts really are, for me, a valuable part of this new work. Now, you're probably thinking he's not mentioned Syria once. And there's, in many respects, a good reason for that, which, although we were writing this book mostly through 2015, when, of course, the Syrian crisis was certainly looming large, nobody up until that point had been able to capture in demographic or data form, statistical data form, what was happening. There were impressions, there were attempts. The UNHCR was doing its best to keep abreast of developments as they emerged. But nobody yet has published an authoritative account of what we can currently say about Europe, at least not in time for the book. So what can we do in the light of that? Well, we have a short statement at the end of the book from churches in Europe speaking into the European Union and really advocating on behalf of newly arrived Syrians, whether Muslim or Christian. And, of course, others from the Middle East, not just Syrians. But also, in other ways, we began to... I, as one of the authors, editing another quarterly bulletin, realized that maybe a better way was to revisit the idea of capturing story and of narrative. And so what I and my co-editors for a slightly different volume did was begin to capture stories of ways in which Muslims were arriving in Europe, being treated by the host society, and also the ways in which some of the evangelical Christian community in Europe was engaging, including mission agencies such as GEM, or Greater Europe Mission. And this is what we did with this quarterly bulletin called Vista. You can get this for free if you want to subscribe. This is the quarterly bulletin that continues as a consequence of my earlier work with the Nova Research Center that Dr. Johnson mentioned. And in this particular edition, the 17-page edition, far longer than normal, we tried to describe many of the stories that were emerging. We got a couple of stories from Germany, one from Greece, two from Hungary, one from France, and 3 overview articles, all trying to understand this last year in retrospect. Now, of course, the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, is and has been working statistically with refugees from Syria, and some of the sorts of things that they've been able to ask to this point are about the background. And this image, this graphic here, shows you the more likely responses that are given to those kind of questions. Most people arriving from Syria indicated they had been previously a student. Prior to that, then you have obviously things like workers, engineer, teacher, employee, as the next large. So the larger the word, the more likely that's the answer they gave. But you'll see that 6% were unaccompanied or separated children, I'm sorry. So unaccompanied minors, sometimes called in Europe. 5% were victims of torture. And I've seen people who've been tortured. I've seen their bodies. The marks are not particularly pleasant from Iran in this particular case. 3% had a chronic disease. 3% were single parents. Many intended to apply for asylum. They were primarily hoping to go to Germany or Sweden. Most of them had reached Greece their first attempted crossing. Most reported a high level of education, 86% having achieved secondary or university level education. Now that last fact alone, I think, underlines my own attempt to continue to engage with this particular theme. We often have the sense that migrants who come to my country are scrounging, they want welfare benefits, they really are kind of all sorts of pejorative terms we could use. But when one looks at this kind of statistic, one realizes that migrants are highly educated. And for that reason, the cause and effect, they're highly motivated people. That's why they've come. You know, I moved halfway around the world from the UK to Australia 4 years ago. It was tough, really hard. The paperwork I had to complete was not easy. And when I arrived in Sydney airport and presented myself to the immigrations official, with myself, my wife, and my family, 2 children, he stamped our papers, welcomed us to Australia, and then in a much quieter voice leaned over and said, "And you're the kind of migrants we need here." And that kind of discrimination, one might say racism, is what often drives this very kind of human. Theologically, we could say, what is that human response that sees people in this way? If you're not the same skin color as me, you're not as welcome as here as you would otherwise be. We were welcomed with open arms. Another wonderful white Caucasian family that speaks English. Hallelujah. We're building heaven on earth in Australia. But this is just an attempt to capture something of the current realities on the ground. And of course, there are all sorts of regional politics around this phenomenon. You know, you'll perhaps, if you read well, be aware that there are now questions being asked about the role of Russia in stimulating further unrest in Syria to drive more refugees into Europe, to destabilize Europe. You know, a weak European Union favors is likely to lead to a stronger Russia. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, who has been coming under increasing pressure, has been very active in Turkey in this last day, trying to formulate a new political strategy for the receiving and welcoming, for the regulating of migrant arrivals in partnership with Turkey. And that kind of accelerates the potential entry of Turkey into the European Union. So these are all issues that become highly politicized, not just at national level, but at global and regional level. Any theological attempt to talk about that, this whole phenomena, has to be aware of those realities too. There's a global politic, real politic involved in this conversation too. So, yeah, over to you. Questions, comments, responses. I'm happy to take both questions and to listen to critique. And I know that some of you will need to rush off to class, but there is time if you would like to take it. Yeah, a question over there. I think. Hello.
Thank you. That was very interesting. And I've been living in the UK in Oxford for the last 6 years, and the church we were part of there had a lot of asylum seekers and migrants, and a large Iranian population in Oxford. And I'd be interested to hear your comment on this model. It was a real challenge to both to the church and to them integrating well. And a model that the kind of community ended up settling on was encouraging them to attend British churches on Sundays, but also having a midweek Iranian fellowship where they could meet and speak and worship in their heart language. Is that something you've seen being done and working?
Yeah, I think there are a range of models that I would see. You've got the fully integrated model on the, let's say, the right-hand side, where it basically just meets once a week, that's it. And everything that's done midweek is all done in mixed small house groups or hub groups. Through to the other extreme where the church is exclusively mono-ethnic and makes it clear that you're not welcome. So what you're describing is one of a range of possibilities which I have seen and I think is probably closer to my ideal end of the spectrum. I have a kind of continuum which I delineate, which tries to spell out where that sits. And I think it's a really good attempt to show that we worship together, but there are things that we may well want to do together in our own mother tongue. Now, what that guarantees, what that attempts to avoid is what I see in some of the mono-ethnic churches that are developing amongst the migrant communities, particularly in Australia. By the second or third generation, the churches are becoming cultural ghettos, cultural cul-de-sacs. They actually have a culture that represents the places they've come from of 30 or 40 years ago, and the emerging generation, their children and grandchildren, are increasingly what we might say culturally hybrid. They are feeling both, on the one hand, American or British, on the other hand, somewhat Afghan or Iranian, but not really either. But they're trying to find their place in a culture where they speak English every day. They don't want to worship the grandparents or even the parents too much, because that brings with it all these cultural values that they've moved away from. So I do think in some parts of the world, at least, the mono-ethnic migrant congregation has a limited future, unless it was just a certain tipping point. You know. But I think as a smaller congregation, that's a model I would encourage, because it allows the cultural interchange in the congregation on the Sunday, so they're all growing and learning to be new Brits together. You know, every person in Australia with a passport is an Australian. There are no kind of Arab Baptist churches. There should be Australian Baptist churches, period, whatever their ethnic composition is. And yet we still often deploy that kind of language. But the midweek meeting gives them the opportunity to express the Arab or Persian identity, and that's really valuable. So thanks for that. I'd love to know which church that was. I probably know it.
Yes, you had mentioned how the European church that you had interviewed had provided a statement to the EU welcoming the migrant. But myself, I feel like my own people here in America, just the Latino community, have been in a sense demonized, especially through political culture today, being called rapists, being called drug dealers. And the scary thing is that a large portion of the evangelical church itself is in support of these types of views. So how do we as Christian leaders change the heart of the modern evangelical church to not see Latino migrants as illegal immigrants rather than the process of human migration, which is something that is much larger that's been happening?
That's a really helpful question. I think the question may well be answered more effectively in the US context by some people here even. But in my own context, perhaps it's easy to talk about Britain stroke Europe. Australia is still very isolated geographically, so it's actually relatively small numbers that are arriving in Australia currently. But of course, we've still demonized minority groups. It does seem to me that key to this, you might want to say, you might expect me to say, well, let's just do a Bible study together and really have a quick look at what God says about people's ethne in the Bible. And that, of course, I'm not going to vote against that, but I do actually believe that the best way is to try and work for encounter with individuals. And that could be one-on-one. It could be church to church, congregation to congregation. But real genuine encounter where I get to know you as a person. That's I think, key. The second one, I think, certainly is to try and understand a biblical perspective on the other, the stranger. There's lots of stuff. People like Daniel Carroll from Denver have written about this really helpfully. And he writes with a keen awareness of the Latino perspective, which is helpful. But I think also just be aware that this will happen. I often say to my students that when we talk about migration and the people involved in that, we're talking about the neighbor, the migrant, and the non-migrant. You know, they're both neighbors. It's not just the migrant's a neighbor, we're all neighbors, migrant, non-migrant. And one of the theological categories we use to talk about this experience of being a neighbor is what we call human sinfulness. So I'm going to find that reflected in the immigration official who says to me, "You're very welcome here." That's an expression of human sinfulness, brokenness. But equally, I will expect from time to time that some of the migrants are likely to be also manipulating the system to their own ends. So I think just a healthy awareness, a more robust doctrine of sin, if you like, and its impact. It's not just about doing bad things. You know, sinfulness is about damaged relationships, and the more we can give that attention. So I would go right back to this encounter. So that's got to be number one. And if you can begin to set up small encounter projects, you're going to go a long, long way, much more quickly than even having a Bible study about it. Sure, fire ahead.
My sense being over, so we moved over here last summer, and my sense was that the church in the UK and maybe across the EU was hesitant to really embrace migrants and was kind of caught up with the rest of the population in this really kind of torn, oh, it must be really bad, but like, we've got tough realities here too. Have you seen that attitude changing, either hardening or opening up? Do you think there are people who are speaking out and trying to welcome migrants in the UK and across the UK?
Yeah. I guess it's partly about perspective, isn't it? You know, if you're a state trooper who patrols the interstates, as far as you're concerned, every car driver is a car wreck waiting to happen. And I guess working within, as an insider to the kind of movement, trying to work towards integration, I tend to see the much more, and I'm a naturally optimistic kind of person anyway, okay? So I have kind of hopes, and I tend to say, maybe I overestimate at times the capacity of the European churches to make that kind of welcome. However, you can turn to statistical analysis which suggests that in terms of the welcome of migrants, across Europe, it's more likely to you're more likely to be positively welcoming to a migrant the more regularly you attend a Christian congregation. So statistically, that's quite clear from the European Value Survey, the World Value Survey, and other social surveys in Europe. Now, of course, that's a statistic. It's not everybody you meet. And I have colleagues who would be much, much more allergic to the entry of migrants into Britain or Europe than I would be. That's not to say we should not assess case for proper assessment of whether somebody should be considered a migrant, and that's part of the debate. You know, who counts as a appropriately refugee? Does everybody have the right to enter Europe? No. Do refugees with a valid claim to refugee status? Yes. The UN is very clear about that.
Thank you, Darrel. Maybe most practically, can you help us determine, as an evangelical Christian, do we vote for Hillary or Trump? Any thoughts
This
on
is
that?
not widely reported elsewhere in the world.
Well, let's pray. Lord, we just give you thanks for just the insights and how the churches in Europe are dealing with this refugee crisis. Lord, at this time, it seems to be that it's changing the history of Europe, and that we see right now the churches wrestling through many of these issues. And Lord, we pray, God, as we evangelicals in North America, as we open our homes and our churches, Lord, we pray that we would have just a heart that really welcomes the alien and strangers. You, Lord, but we just pray, God, for wisdom to know how best to be a witness for you. We pray, God, for the many ministries and churches and mission agencies and pastors in Europe. Lord, we pray, God, that they would really demonstrate the love of Christ during this very difficult time. We pray these things giving thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.